Hey guys, tonight we drift deep into the Saharan sands, where the stars blink quietly over a city so sleepy, even the camels seem to walk in slow motion. You find yourself in a world of soft footsteps on sun-baked earth, where the air hums with centuries of silence, and the only thing louder than the wind is the whisper of parchment pages flipping gently in the dusk. You're entering Timbuktu. Yes, that Timbuktu. The one that sounds made up, like a place someone invented just to win a game of Scrabble. But it's real. And more than that, it was once the knowledge capital of the world, just very, very quietly. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing how far and wide we drift together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by trudging across a stretch of sand so wide and flat that the horizon seems to yawn with you. Every step kicks up a lazy puff of dust. You're following a caravan, tufts of fabric flapping gently against the humps of stoic camels, their eyes half-lidded as if they're halfway through a nap they never quite finish. You're in the Sahel region of West Africa, probably around the 11th or 12th century. There are no signs, no gates, no bright neon welcome to let you know you've entered one of history's most legendary cities. Just the gradual rise of clay buildings shaped like upside-down teacups, clustered tightly as if huddling for warmth. It's quiet, always quiet. Timbuktu doesn't burst into history, it kind of slouches in. Originally a seasonal encampment for Tuareg nomads, it starts as a rest stop for travelers pushing salt and gold across the desert. They need shade, they need water, they need a place to park their tired camels and complain about their joints. So they build a well, then a few tents, then a few houses, and as the sun rolls on, the houses grow into something bigger. This is the moment where most cities might hire an architect or throw a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Timbuktu just shrugs and keeps going. You pass by a market where everything seems muffled. Vendors with soft voices offering salt cakes, strings of beads, swatches of fabric that catch the sunlight and turn it into sleepy rainbows. Even the children play quietly, tossing pebbles into the dust and pretending not to compete. It smells like dry hay, old leather, and heat. You round a corner and come across the first real structure of interest, a mosque. Low and heavy, like someone pressed it down with the palm of a very patient hand. Its walls are thick with sun-dried mud brick, and wooden beams stick out like eyelashes. The locals call it banco, a building style that's basically earth, sun, and a little prayer. The call to prayer echoes in the distance. It doesn't startle you. It just rolls over your shoulders like a warm towel. You find yourself moving slower, breathing deeper. You're adjusting to the Timbuktu pace, somewhere between afternoon nap and hibernating tortoise. But here's the kicker. This slouchy, dusty town, it's about to become one of the most important intellectual hubs on Earth. Yup, the place where the streets are half sand and the goats sleep in doorways is about to outpace medieval Paris, Baghdad, and even Cairo in one crucial department: books. You heard that right, books, scrolls, manuscripts, piles of them. This city, which doesn't even seem to care if you know it exists, is quietly assembling an army of scribes, scholars, and thinkers. And they're writing everything: medicine, law, astronomy, poetry, theology, algebraic equations that would make your high school math teacher weep. Of course, Timbuktu doesn't shout about it, that would be rude. So, what causes this sleepy outpost to start stockpiling books like bedtime snacks? Blame trade. The trans-Saharan trade routes, giant invisible veins stretching from the Atlantic to the Nile, pump wealth straight into Timbuktu's slow-beating heart. Caravans bring salt from the north, gold from the south, and ideas from everywhere in between. Salt is the big one. It's so valuable, it's literally worth its weight in gold. They cut it in slabs and haul it across the desert like giant dusty chocolate bars. Meanwhile, the Niger River quietly loops by just a few miles away, adding the occasional cool breeze and hinting ever so gently that boats are an option too. All this trade attracts people, merchants of course, but also scholars, clerics, calligraphers, and curious minds looking for a quiet place to read. They find it. In Timbuktu, the idea of reading for pleasure isn't some new hobby, it's a cultural pillar. Even the donkeys probably know a few verses by heart. And here's a fun fact. The name Timbuktu is believed to come from a Tuareg phrase meaning the place of Buktu's well. Buktu being a woman who once guarded a water well here. So yes, this whole empire of intellect might have been sparked by one extremely responsible lady and her bucket. Respect. You stop at a low building near the city's edge. There's no sign, no plaque, no dramatic entrance. But inside, it's cool and dark and smells faintly of old ink and roasted millet. Someone is reading aloud, softly, from a manuscript propped up on a wooden stand. You catch fragments, something about stars, angles, the timing of prayer, and maybe a poem about the moon. The man reading is older. His voice rasps gently. You can barely make out the script on the parchment, but the lines twist like vines across the page. Arabic calligraphy, elegant and deliberate. Not all the scholars here are Muslim, but Islamic learning shapes much of the academic culture. After all, you're in the middle of a golden age of Islamic scholarship. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu was ever a true city-state of its own, or just a high-functioning trading town with a really good book club. But one thing's certain, it becomes famous not for its wars or walls, but for what it preserves. You stroll outside and spot a boy chasing a goat that has stolen a scroll. The goat is winning. The boy yells something about the geometry notes. You can't help but chuckle. Timbuktu, where even the livestock have literary preferences. The sun dips lower. Shadows stretch across the sandy alleys. The city seems to settle even deeper into itself, like an old man sighing into a soft chair. But beneath the calm, a storm of knowledge is brewing. Not the loud revolutionary kind, the quiet kind, the kind that waits patiently in bound pages until someone decides to crack one open. And you're just in time. You wake to the soft braying of camels and the faint clatter of clay bowls. Timbuktu stirs gently, like a cat stretching in a sunbeam. The early light is thin and golden, gliding over rooftops like a silk scarf. Dust hangs in the air, but doesn't feel dirty, more like part of the ambiance. A reminder that you are, quite literally, breathing history. Today, you follow the trade. Camels shuffle past in slow, hypnotic lines, their bells tinkling like wind chimes on vacation. They carry bundles of salt from the mines of Tagaza to the north, great gray slabs stacked like giant granola bars and just as dry. Traders call it white gold, and they're not exaggerating. Salt doesn't just season your food here, it preserves it, pays your rent, and settles your debts. It's currency, sometimes more valuable than actual gold. Imagine trying to pay your Netflix bill with a giant salt slab. Try explaining that to customer service. But alongside the salt comes another, more golden traveler, gold itself. Plucked from the rivers and soil of the south, especially from places like Wangara, it's packed in leather pouches and tied beneath the bellies of camels. The sheer volume moving through Timbuktu is enough to catch the attention of empires and pirates and scholars, always the scholars. You wander through the marketplace, noisy now, but not chaotic. It's a calm hum of bartering and greetings, the occasional laugh, and the tap-tap of a metal scale weighing salt against dates. Your senses adjust. A hint of sandalwood, the bite of fermented milk, the soft resistance of worn leather under your sandals. And amidst it all, books. They're not stacked on shelves or displayed in shop windows. No one here is yelling 2-for-1 Quran commentaries. But if you look closely, you'll see scrolls tucked into belts, bound pages wrapped in leather and carried under arms like precious babies. Merchants trade them quietly in back corners. Sometimes they cost more than a camel, sometimes more than 10. You duck into a shady alcove where a trader is unwrapping something carefully. Not spices, not cloth, a manuscript. The ink has faded to a ghostly brown, but the script remains clear. It's a text on astronomy, drawn with precision and annotated in the margins. A buyer nods slowly, as if deciding whether this particular treatise on lunar phases is worth the 4 goats and 1 very smug chicken he's offering. This is the real currency of Timbuktu now, knowledge. Not just religious texts, though those are common. You'll find treatises on medicine, law, ethics, botany, history, even love poems so flowery they could probably fertilize an entire desert garden. Timbuktu is becoming a city of ideas. It helps that 3 major empires are circling it like sleepy satellites. The Mali Empire lays the groundwork. Then Songhai takes the baton and runs with it. Well, jogs with it might be more accurate, this being Timbuktu. Each empire brings wealth, infrastructure, and just enough stability to keep scholars scribbling and camels ambling. You pause at a small gathering under a mango tree. A bearded scholar in a faded robe holds court over a ring of young men. He's reciting from a manuscript in Arabic, but his audience isn't just nodding politely. They're asking questions, debating, referring to other texts pulled from satchels and shoulder slings. This is a majlis, a scholarly circle, and one of the quiet engines of Timbuktu's fame. Here, knowledge isn't hoarded, it's chewed on, passed around, occasionally disagreed with. And yes, if you're wondering, some students do fall asleep mid-discussion. It's practically a rite of passage. One kid snoozes with his forehead resting gently on his own foot. You envy his flexibility. The city's most famous scholar, Ahmed Baba, won't be born for a few more centuries, but already the groundwork is being laid for his kind of intellectual playground. There's no single university building with a campus map and a mascot. Instead, scholars teach in mosques, in courtyards, in living rooms. Education here is personalized, informal, and deeply rigorous. And word is getting out. Pilgrims from North Africa pass through, carrying rumors of this sleepy city where even the fishmongers can quote poetry. Travelers from Cairo, Fez, and even Mecca stop by, expecting a dusty outpost and instead finding an academic utopia. If utopias came with sand in your shoes and goats who won't stop bleeding during lectures. One particularly fringe detail you pick up as you pass 2 gossiping traders. Apparently, some folks believe Timbuktu's books were protected by magic, that the ink was mixed with sacred water, that certain scrolls couldn't be burned, only buried. These whispers aren't in the manuscripts, they linger in the marketplace, in the margins of memory. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu's book trade was driven primarily by religious piety or pure scholarly curiosity. The truth, as usual, is somewhere in the dusty middle. The Islamic push for literacy definitely helps. If you're going to recite the Quran properly, you'd better know how to read. But soon enough, people go beyond recitation. They start to write about what they're reading, and then they write about that. And suddenly, you've got a full-blown academic echo chamber. You stop for a bowl of sweet millet porridge served by a cheerful woman who also corrects your pronunciation of astrolabe with terrifying accuracy. Timbuktu is like that. You'll order lunch and get a philosophy lecture. You'll ask for directions and end up enrolled in a geometry seminar. It's the books that anchor it all, not just because they're valuable, but because they become part of the city's identity. Owning one is a status symbol. Copying one is a full-time job. Studying one is a spiritual act. They're written in Arabic, yes, but also in Songhai, Tamashek, and Fulfulde. Timbuktu isn't just preserving Islamic scholarship, it's remixing it with local flavor. And here's the kicker that scholars still scratch their heads over. Many of these manuscripts are written on imported paper, from Italy, from Spain, some from as far as China. How does that even happen? This sleepy desert town somehow plugged itself into a global supply chain hundreds of years before Amazon Prime. Try getting 2-day delivery to the middle of the Sahara. Go on, try. You cross paths with a wandering poet who offers to write your name into a verse, for a price, of course. He produces a scrap of paper and a quill that looks like it's been through 3 lifetimes. You accept. He scrawls something with flair, then recites it in a whispery tone that makes you feel like royalty or a very important antelope. The sun is higher now. The marketplace is thinning. The traders are retreating into the shade. And the books? They're back in satchels, tucked beneath tunics, cradled like the sleepy offspring of ink and curiosity. You wander back through the alleyways. A boy passes carrying a bundle of firewood in one hand and a worn manuscript in the other. Balance. That's Timbuktu in a nutshell. Between commerce and contemplation, between sweat and study, between dust and dreams. And as you duck into another shaded passage, already cooler than the street, you realize something. This city is building its future not with stone, but with scrolls. Not with walls, with words. And you're right in the middle of it, one quiet footstep at a time.
By now, you've acclimated to the rhythm of Timbuktu, a city that doesn't rush, doesn't shout, and certainly doesn't multitask. Even the pigeons seem to flap their wings in slow motion. You wander past palm-fringed courtyards and low archways, ducking beneath strands of drying linen, your feet raising puffs of dust as you go. Today, your path winds toward the heart of the city's intellectual soul, the mosques that double as universities. You start with Jingra Reber. Its name alone sounds like a drumbeat wrapped in silk. Built in the early 14th century under the rule of the great Mansa Musa, yes, that Mansa Musa, the one who turned a pilgrimage into an economic earthquake, the mosque is more than a place of worship. It's an institution, a monument, a sort of glorified mud castle for geniuses. You approach its thick, sand-colored walls. They look soft from afar, like baked meringue, but you know better. This is Banco, the same blend of mud, straw, and water that keeps Timbuktu standing. Wooden beams poke from the surface, serving as scaffolding for repairs and, unofficially, excellent perches for sleepy doves. Inside, light filters through narrow slits, striping the air in soft gold. The floor is cool and sandy beneath your feet. A scholar's voice echoes gently from deep within, slow and melodic, like a river describing itself. You step quietly between students seated on mats, their eyes fixed on wooden slates covered in charcoal script. No desks, no laptops, no motivational posters, just minds, language, and the occasional cough that sounds like it's trying not to interrupt. The mosque was commissioned after Mansa Musa's legendary Hajj to Mecca. On his way back, he stops in Cairo and flings gold around so liberally that he causes inflation. Not a humble brag, an actual documented economic disruption. As if Jeff Bezos tossed Amazon stock into a fountain and smiled politely. But Musa doesn't just bring back gold and camels, he brings back architects and scholars. One of them, a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, is credited with designing Djinguereber. Historians still argue whether he actually built it or just offered some notes and left before anyone asked for a sketch. Either way, the result is a marvel of mud, weathered but wise, humble but heavy with meaning. As you sit in the shade of its outer courtyard, the idea starts to settle into your bones. Timbuktu doesn't separate sacred from scholarly. In this city, prayer and problem-solving sit on the same mat. You might memorize a Quranic verse and then segue into a discussion about the phases of Venus. It's not about contradiction, it's about cohesion. Outside the mosque, a group of students practice reading aloud under the guidance of a marabu, a local religious teacher. The boys take turns holding a wooden loo, a sort of primitive tablet, repeating verses with a sing-song rhythm that sounds strangely soothing, like linguistic water dripping steadily into memory. You watch one student rinse his loo clean with a splash of water and begin again, this time copying lines from a legal treatise. Same tool, different knowledge, same reverence. You wander on, your path leading you to Sidi Yahya Mosque, built a century later. Its minaret rises modestly above the city's skyline, like a mud-smeared finger pointing toward the sun. This one, too, functions as a learning center. The interior smells faintly of dried dates, ink, and sun-warmed parchment. A student dozes gently of the corner, his turban slipping to reveal a mop of curls. You resist the urge to do the same.
The mosques of Timbuktu aren't just spaces, they're vessels. They hold not only prayer, but memory. Knowledge is stored here in the form of oral tradition, written texts, shared debates. And because paper doesn't do well with mold or rats or general human clumsiness, manuscripts are kept in tight bundles, wrapped in leather, protected by layers of fabric, and often buried in family homes when war or weather threatens. You overhear an elderly woman say, "A book without a home is a leaf in the wind." She isn't quoting a proverb, she's just telling the neighbor kid not to drop his manuscript in the chicken pen again. Inside another courtyard, two scholars are arguing, but in the quiet, deeply respectful way that makes you feel like you're watching a debate between clouds. They're discussing a hadith, a legal opinion, and whether a certain scholar's interpretation was too literal or not literal enough. One cites a book from Fez, the other waves a local text. They nod, they frown. One scratches his beard. A cat passes between them, utterly disinterested in jurisprudence. Here's where things get deliciously tangled. Timbuktu doesn't just consume scholarship from elsewhere, it produces it. Its scholars write commentaries, which spark counter-commentaries, which get bundled with footnotes, which are copied and sent back to Cairo, where they become part of the record. Some of the surviving manuscripts are like academic layer cakes: core text, margin notes, corrections, rebuttals, snarky doodles. One even contains a drawing of a bird wearing a hat. Nobody knows why. But scholars still argue over how much of this learning was local innovation versus imported analysis. Did Timbuktu forge a new intellectual identity, or did it simply mirror Mecca's academic glow? There's no clean answer, just lots of scrolls and not enough cats to sit on them. You pause to look at a page being copied by a scribe. His quill glides with purpose. The ink is made from charcoal and acacia sap, thick and fragrant. He dips, he swirls, he writes. The letters curve like vines, each one a tiny sculpture. He doesn't talk, he doesn't blink. He's been at it for hours. He finally stops to sip water, his hand stained like a painter's. "I am not a writer," he says softly. "I am a shadow of the writer who came before." It's poetic, it's humble, it's also possibly the best t-shirt slogan this city will never print. You stroll through another narrow alley, past crumbling walls patched with more love than mortar. Here, even architecture has memory. The shadows are cooler now, longer. You pass a door carved with delicate patterns, a private library perhaps. Many families maintain personal collections, passed down like jewelry or rice recipes. One such home belongs to the family of a famous jurist. They've hidden their books in secret compartments, wrapped in goat leather and lined with cotton. There's a rumor that one manuscript contains a detailed map of stars visible only during eclipses. Another outlines surgical techniques, using tools made from carved bone. You press your ear to the door and swear you hear the faint shuffle of pages, or maybe that's just your heartbeat. And here's a bit of trivia so charming it feels fake. Some of Timbuktu's manuscripts contain marginalia written by bored students. One complains about the heat. Another asks for forgiveness for a sloppy copy job. A third thanks his teacher for the lentil stew. Imagine a medieval tweet immortalized in ink. But nothing here is hurried. Nothing is wasted. Timbuktu doesn't build knowledge so much as tend it like a desert garden, slowly, lovingly, and always with one eye on the sky. As evening falls, the air cools. The call to prayer rolls across the city like a lullaby, echoing off mud brick and memory. The mosques settle into shadow. The students pack up their slates. And you sit beneath a fig tree, back against a warm wall, and wonder how a place so quiet could have taught the world to listen. The sun hasn't quite risen, but Timbuktu is already humming, softly, sleepily, like a cat purring itself into consciousness. A rooster somewhere croaks like it just learned the job. You stretch, yawn, and shuffle out into the sandy alleyways, rubbing your eyes as the world shifts from blue-gray to gold. Today, you follow the paper trail, literally. If Timbuktu had a secret superpower, it wouldn't be camel taming or mystical sand dancing, though those sound fun. No, it would be the simple, astonishing act of keeping things. This city, perched on the edge of the Sahara and buffeted by centuries of wind, war, and forgetfulness, has somehow clung to one of the world's richest stashes of manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them. You duck into a small house tucked behind a crumbling wall, where a wooden door creaks open onto a courtyard shaded by a fig tree. A man in his 60s greets you with a smile, and the kind of slowness that suggests he has spent most of his life listening to paper breathe. He's the keeper of his family's manuscript library. Not a formal librarian, more like a cross between a monk and a grandpa. He leads you into a room where the walls are lined with wooden chests. No fancy shelving, no temperature-controlled glass, just chest after chest of bundled parchment and leather, some tied with string, others swaddled in linen like newborns. He opens one carefully and pulls out a manuscript. The pages are a warm caramel brown, etched with dark ink that curves and coils in Arabic script. The scent is unmistakable. Dry earth, old ink, and something faintly sweet. Maybe tamarind, maybe memory. You inhale it deeply and try not to sneeze.
This, you're told, is a treatise on astronomy written by a 16th century scholar who cross-referenced Quranic verses with Babylonian star charts. You nod thoughtfully while trying not to reveal that you once confused Orion's belt with the Big Dipper. Timbuktu's manuscripts cover a galaxy of topics. Religion, sure, but also science, mathematics, poetry, law, medicine, grammar, philosophy, and letters between scholars gossiping about who misquoted Aristotle. One bundle includes a guide on how to treat scorpion stings using sheep's milk. Another debates the best time of year to plant date palms based on lunar cycles. One particularly dazzling scroll contains a musical score written in notational marks that resemble tiny birds. Nobody can read it today, but a local musician claims it matches the rhythm of traditional drumming. Could be true, could be wishful thinking. Historians still argue whether the musical manuscripts of Timbuktu were intended for performance or simply poetic decoration. The cats, as always, remain neutral. As you peer closer, you realize that these are not just texts. They are conversations between centuries, between continents, between scholars whose names have faded, but whose arguments still thrum like distant thunder. You move to another house-turned-library. Here, a young woman named Awa is cataloging a box of manuscripts. She's working with a laptop, a delicate brush, and the kind of determination usually reserved for coral reef conservationists or people organizing their fridge by color. She lets you watch as she cleans a brittle page, then inputs its title into a database. "This one is about the ethics of trade," she murmurs. It quotes a scholar from Baghdad and another from Marrakesh. And this note in the margin? A poem about camels. I think it's a metaphor. You ask how long it will take to catalog everything. She laughs. A few lifetimes, maybe.
Awa is part of a local project, one of many, trying to digitize and preserve Timbuktu's vast manuscript heritage. You picture files and drives and servers quietly humming somewhere, holding centuries of wisdom in ones and zeros. It's comforting, also kind of weird. Timbuktu's deepest secrets now float on the cloud. But it wasn't always so peaceful. During recent conflicts, when armed groups threatened the city, local families smuggled thousands of manuscripts out under cover of night. Some hid them in metal trunks, some in rice sacks. One man disguised them as firewood. Another wrapped bundles in children's clothing so they looked like sleeping babies. There's something cinematic about it. Librarians in disguise, dashing through moonlit alleys with ancient legal codes stuffed into their robes. Except it wasn't a movie, it was real and risky. You ask Awa if she was scared. She nods, of course, but the books are part of us. Losing them would be like losing memory itself. It's hard to argue with that. As you walk back through the city's quieter streets, the weight of that memory feels heavier than sandbags. These manuscripts weren't written in a vacuum. They were debated, copied, argued over, and whispered about over tea. A scholar might spend a lifetime composing one commentary, only for his son to scribble a contradictory note in the margin. Families passed them down like secret spells. Some were never meant to be published. Others were copied 100 times and sent across the desert on camelback. You pass a boy delivering bread and spot a thin notebook peeking from his satchel. A school text? A copied poem? Maybe a shopping list? It doesn't matter. The spirit is the same. Of course, not all manuscripts are neat or noble. Some are patchy. Others are downright confusing. One bundle, preserved in a local museum, includes a love poem followed immediately by a recipe for sour millet stew. The transition is abrupt, but kind of beautiful. Historians still argue whether this was an editing mistake or just an efficient use of parchment.
You meander into a small room lit only by slats of sun and a single oil lamp. A librarian sits with a magnifying glass, puzzling over a document that appears to be written in two languages, Arabic and Songhai. The two columns dance together on the page, sometimes agreeing, sometimes contradicting. She tells you it's a bilingual legal code, meant to help merchants settle disputes in multi-ethnic markets. You wonder aloud if that ever worked. She smiles. Probably not, but at least they tried. That's the secret undercurrent of Timbuktu's manuscript culture. It's not about perfection, it's about persistence. These texts endured sandstorms, colonizers, fire, flood, mildew, war, and teenagers who used pages as coasters. And yet, here they are. Fragile, yes, but alive. You leave the room slowly, not wanting to disturb the stillness. Outside, the air feels hotter now. You squint at the horizon and think about how improbable all this is. A remote desert city with more ancient books than most European capitals. A community that turned survival into an intellectual art. A place where literacy didn't mean status, it meant duty. And even stranger, much of the world ignored it for centuries. Western explorers rolled into town in the 19th century, expecting to find mythical gold mines and magical fountains, and instead found a sleepy book town covered in dust. Some left disappointed. Others stayed and wrote breathless accounts of Negro libraries and African Aristotles, their surprise revealing more about themselves than the city. One even tried to buy a manuscript with his boots. The seller declined. You pass a wall scrawled with chalk, the day's Quranic lesson left up like graffiti. A child stands in front of it, reciting slowly to himself. You can't tell if he's studying or singing. Somewhere nearby, a rooster tries again. Still terrible. But now it feels like part of the rhythm. You sit beneath an awning, sipping something sweet and minty, and wonder how many stories are still locked in trunks across the city. You imagine a child years from now opening one and discovering not just words, but a way of seeing the world, patiently, precisely, and always with room for one more footnote.
The air is cooler today, with a sleepy breeze winding through the alleyways of Timbuktu, as if the city itself is exhaling slowly. You tuck your scarf around your shoulders and head toward a structure that's less poetic than parchment, but no less important, the Sankore Mosque. Now, mosque might make you think of towering domes and elaborate minarets, but Sankore is built from sun-baked mud and timber. It looks like a sandcastle with scholarly aspirations. The tall minaret rises like a watchful sentry above the quarter, its wooden beams sticking out like whiskers. Pigeons perch on them, judging you. But this isn't just a mosque, it's a school. Or was, or still is, depending on how you define school and still. Back in the 14th and 15th centuries, Sankore was one of the most respected centers of learning in the Islamic world. Think of it as the Oxford of the Sahara, only with more goats and less ivy. Scholars flocked here from Cairo, Baghdad, even far-off Andalusia. They came for the books, the debates, the weather. Probably not the food, but you never know. Inside, it's quiet, cool. The walls seem to hum with the memory of ideas. You imagine students sitting cross-legged on mats, reading aloud to their teachers, repeating passages until they could recite entire legal codes from memory, which sounds impressive until you remember that some of us forget our own Wi-Fi passwords twice a week. Education at Sankore didn't look like modern schooling. There were no grades, no graduation gowns, no overpriced hoodies from the campus store. Instead, it was built on oral repetition, deep mentorship, and a frankly terrifying number of footnotes. Students studied law, theology, logic, astronomy, grammar, and poetry. A few even dabbled in medicine. Timbuktu had treatises on everything from diagnosing fevers to treating headaches with powdered gazelle horn. One manuscript even described how to cure melancholy by listening to oud music near a pond at dusk. Very specific, possibly made up. Historians still argue whether medieval Timbuktu's medicine leaned more scientific or spiritual. But perhaps the most remarkable part? You didn't have to be rich to study here. In fact, most students lived in the homes of scholars or other families, working part-time jobs, tending animals, helping with housework, or copying manuscripts by hand. If you're imagining medieval interns covered in ink stains, you're not far off. You're invited to sit in the shade of the mosque's courtyard, where an old scholar named Sidi is teaching a few teenagers. He's going over a legal riddle. If two merchants disagree on the weight of a sack of dates and neither has scales, whose testimony counts more, the seller or the buyer? The teens debate. One says the buyer because he has incentive to be cautious. Another says the seller because he owns the goods. Sidi nods sagely and adds, "What if the sack was dropped by a donkey?" They all groan. Apparently, this is a classic twist. Timbuktu's scholars loved this kind of thinking, argument layered on argument, always returning to the text. But there was also joy in it. A scholar once wrote that study without laughter is like bread without salt. You imagine classrooms filled with groans, laughter, and those intense glances people give when they're trying to remember if a certain scholar from Kairouan supported calendar-based fasting. And yes, women studied here too. Historical records mention female scholars, scribes, and teachers, particularly within private homes and family-run learning networks. One particularly sharp-minded woman, named Amina bint Abdallah, was known for correcting her father's grammar mid-lecture. Respectfully, mostly. You're told she once debated a visiting scholar and gently destroyed his argument on lunar inheritance law. He left town a day later, possibly on vacation, possibly to cry in the desert. No one's quite sure. As you stroll through the mosque's shaded walkways, you notice small niches carved into the walls. These were used to store manuscripts, but also for acoustics. The builders of Sankore knew how to make sound carry and soften. You whisper a few words and hear them bounce gently back to you. It feels like talking to the building itself. Sidi tells you that even the layout of Sankore was designed with education in mind. The minaret doubles as a sundial. The orientation of the prayer hall aligns with key celestial markers. And the inner courtyard can host dozens of students comfortably under its tree canopy, which provides shade even during the harshest days. Of course you're thinking, this all sounds a bit too perfect. Was Sankore really that impressive? Or is this just romantic legend? Good question. There are gaps in the records. We don't know the exact number of students. We don't have full attendance logs. Some manuscripts attribute incredible feats to the university, like producing thousands of graduates each year or hosting 10-story libraries. That's probably exaggerated. Like, medieval Timbuktu wasn't Hogwarts, but it also wasn't a backwater. Historians still argue whether Sankore's reputation was inflated by later storytellers, or whether European chroniclers simply couldn't believe that Black African scholars had created a thriving intellectual culture on par with their own. It's an awkward truth, but there it is. You wander further and find a worn tablet tucked into a corner. It's a student's board, still streaked with ink. It smells faintly of charcoal and neem. You imagine the young scholar who once held it, scribbling, lessons, erasing, writing again, repeating verses until they lived in the marrow of his bones. Some nights, they say, the students would gather outside under the stars, reciting aloud in groups until the sky faded from indigo to dusty pink. A kind of cosmic study hall. You wonder what that must have sounded like. Dozens of voices murmuring in unison, the low drone of knowledge echoing across the desert. Not exactly party material, but still kind of beautiful.
And speaking of stars, Sankara didn't just teach religious texts. Astronomical manuscripts found in Timbuktu include diagrams of planetary motion, lunar eclipses, and star maps with annotations in Arabic and local languages. Some scholars even tried to calculate the circumference of the Earth using camel travel distances between oases. One text argues that the Milky Way is a river of souls. Another insists it's spilled milk from a careless angel. Science, poetry, or bedtime metaphor? Maybe all three. You sit under a tree in the courtyard and think about all the knowledge that passed through these walls. Some preserved, some lost, some hiding in trunks under someone's grandmother's bed. You think about students grappling with theology while swatting flies. You think about a girl named Amina winning debates and a scholar calculating orbits by candlelight. You also think about how hard it is to concentrate without coffee, but mercifully, someone hands you a cup of local brew, bitter and spiced with something you can't quite place. Maybe clove, maybe sleep? As the call to prayer rings out, soft and melodic, the whole quarter seems to still itself. The pigeons hush, the dust settles, even the goats pause mid-chew. You close your eyes, and in the quiet that follows, you feel it, a kind of intellectual gravity, the pull of a place where learning wasn't just a means to power or prestige, it was a rhythm, a tradition, a devotion. The Sankore Mosque wasn't built to impress, it was built to endure. And somehow, it has.
The heat hums gently around your ears, but you barely notice. You're walking through the streets again, only this time, you're trailing behind someone rather special. A man in a flowing robe with a beard that looks like it contains at least 3 riddles and a small family of sparrows. His name is Ahmad Baba. Yes, that Ahmad Baba. You might not have heard of him, but in Timbuktu, his name carries the weight of centuries. Scholar, jurist, writer, bibliophile, and at one point, prisoner. But we'll get there. Right now, he's just walking with purpose through the quarter, clutching a manuscript under his arm. You follow quietly, your sandals making almost no sound on the soft sand. Everyone nods as he passes, kids scatter, a cat stares. It's the late 1500s, and Timbuktu is no longer under Songhai rule. A few decades earlier, a new power entered the chat, the Saadian dynasty of Morocco. Think of them as the ambitious cousins from North Africa who wanted a piece of the gold pie Timbuktu was always rumored to be hoarding. Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur, flush with dreams of empire and probably way too much saffron, sends his army south. In 1591, Moroccan forces storm the city. Gunpowder meets spears. It's not a fair fight. Timbuktu falls. Now, you'd think the Moroccans would immediately loot the libraries, burn the books, and replace everything with palm trees and bad poetry, but they don't, not really. Instead, they try to rule the city like a prize they've won, but don't quite understand. And so begins the Age of Tension. Ahmad Baba, born into a respected family of scholars, finds himself caught between these worlds. He's a man who once wrote more than 40 books on law, theology, and history, who believed that knowledge was sacred, who thought slavery was unjust, and spent a considerable part of his life writing treatises against the enslavement of Muslims, particularly black Muslims, which made him quite unpopular with some of the Moroccan elite. And then, because of political suspicion and maybe a little paranoia, he's arrested and dragged off to Marrakesh. Picture it, a towering intellect tossed into a foreign jail, surrounded by people who see him as a threat just for knowing too much. It sounds like the plot of a medieval legal drama. Ahmad Baba's students are devastated. Timbuktu is outraged. The cats are probably indifferent, but you get the idea. But even in prison, he writes, he debates, he argues with the guards. At one point, someone reportedly asks him how many books he had back in Timbuktu, and he replies, over 1,600, not counting those lent out. There's a long pause before someone mutters, "Huh, nerd." Eventually, he's released, and when he finally returns to Timbuktu, it's not with bitterness, but with a renewed mission. He teaches again, he writes, he mentors a new generation of scholars. His influence lingers for centuries. You stop by a quiet room said to have once been his study. A single window filters sunlight onto a low wooden table. There are ink stains on the floor, like ghostly fingerprints. You sit cross-legged on the mat and imagine him here, correcting a student's work, writing by lamplight, whispering to himself about footnotes. Scholars still argue whether Ahmad Baba's writings were revolutionary or simply a reflection of the strong intellectual traditions that had long existed in West Africa. Either way, his voice helped shape the memory of Timbuktu far beyond the desert. A young boy enters the room behind you. He carries a manuscript wrapped in cloth and gently places it on the table. It's a copy of one of Ahmad Baba's works, a discussion on legal rulings in trade and commerce. Riveting stuff if you're into 16th century economic policy, but for this boy, it's something more. It's a connection.
Timbuktu didn't just create scholars, it revered them. And Ahmad Baba became the face of a resistance rooted not in weapons, but in wisdom. When the Moroccans tried to reduce the city to an outpost, it was people like him who kept the flame alive. But you also start to notice something else, something quieter. During this time of occupation, the culture of hiding books begins. It's not widespread yet, but the idea takes root. People start building secret compartments into walls. Manuscripts are wrapped and buried, stored in chests, passed between families like heirlooms or smuggled treasure. It's a subtle shift, but it changes everything. Because as outside powers begin to erode the city's independence, the manuscripts become more than books. They become identity. Proof that Timbuktu was, and still is, a place of knowledge, of resistance, of memory. And here's the strange part. Many of these manuscripts survive not because of libraries, but because of regular people. Families, farmers, traders, tailors. They wrapped them in leather and linen, stored them in closets and cellars, and whispered to their children, "This is important. Never sell it. Never burn it. Someday, you'll understand." You leave the study and head down an alley filled with the scent of cardamom and drying dates. Someone's playing a reed flute in the distance, slow, plaintive, hypnotic. The kind of music that makes you question all your life choices, including why you wore sandals into a sandstorm. A merchant greets you. He offers tea, of course. They always do. As you sip the strong, sweet brew, he talks about his family's manuscripts. They've had them for generations. No one reads them now, but no one dares throw them out either. He pulls out a wooden chest. Inside are fragile scrolls, tightly rolled, the script so fine it looks like thread. You ask what they say. He shrugs. No one knows. Maybe love poems, maybe legal contracts, maybe instructions for building a flying machine out of ostrich feathers and regret. Probably not the last one, but still, tempting. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of manuscripts in Timbuktu, some claim hundreds of thousands, has been exaggerated. After all, manuscript can mean anything from a multi-volume theological treatise to a 2-page shopping list with impressive calligraphy. But that doesn't change the truth of their existence. They are here. They were always here. And so, even as Morocco tightens its grip, and trade routes start to dry up, and the golden days begin to flicker, Timbuktu refuses to fade. It simply adapts. Ahmad Baba dies in 1627, but he doesn't really leave. His writings are copied. His name is spoken with reverence. Centuries later, when a modern library is built in Timbuktu, it will be named after him. You walk back through the quarter as the sky begins to darken. The mosque minarets catch the last golden light. A child runs past you with a slate board tucked under one arm. You hear someone reciting in a nearby courtyard. And you wonder, how many cities in history survived conquest, not by swords or treaties, but by writing, by preserving ideas in ink and memory? Not many, but Timbuktu is one of them. As you slip into your bedroll for the night, belly full of tea and brain full of Ahmad Baba quotes you'll probably forget by morning, the sound of rustling pages follows you like a lullaby. Sleep comes slowly, but when it does, it's heavy and warm, like sand piled over treasure, like history pressed between pages, waiting.
Morning light drips like honey through a cracked mud brick window. You stretch, bones softly protesting, and shuffle out into the whispering alleys of Timbuktu again. The air feels different now, not heavier, just quieter, as if the city itself is holding its breath. Because things are changing. You glance around and realize you're standing at the edge of something, perhaps decline, or perhaps just another transformation. It's the 17th century now, creeping steadily toward the 18th. The Moroccan hold has grown wearier, more symbolic than strategic. Their garrisons remain, but their grip is loosening. The desert has ways of wearing things down, including empires. Trade routes that once pulsed like arteries now seem more like old roads sketched in the sand. Caravans still come, but they're fewer, smaller, and often rerouted through safer terrain. With them, the flow of gold, salt, and scholarly gossip slows to a trickle. And yet, Timbuktu does not disappear. It simmers. The mad flurry of intellectual and economic activity has mellowed into a steady, persistent hum. Schools still operate, manuscripts still get copied, although not at the fevered pace of earlier centuries. Scholars still teach, though sometimes their classrooms are just shaded courtyards with 3 students and a goat who refuses to leave. You're invited into one of those courtyards. A middle-aged teacher with a tunic patched in 6 places and a voice smoother than river stones is reciting from a battered manuscript. His students listen intently, their slates in their laps, fingers twitching with the rhythm of the words. He pauses to correct one boy's pronunciation. The boy scowls. The goat sneezes. It's not grand, but it's real. Here's the thing. This period of decline isn't a total collapse. Timbuktu doesn't implode, it contracts, like a sleeping cat curling tighter to conserve warmth. There's less patronage, fewer grand commissions, but there's still passion. The city adjusts its expectations and simply survives. That's harder than it sounds. You hear whispers of instability, raids, banditry, even the occasional drought. Local power dynamics shift constantly, with various regional warlords and tribal alliances trying to fill the power vacuum left by a retreating Morocco. Nothing lasts for long. Authority is temporary, but learning, well, that sticks around like a stubborn date pit between your teeth. And guess what else emerges? The rise of manuscript families. You're probably imagining that correctly. Households, often modest, becoming guardians of knowledge passed down through generations. Each manuscript treated like a fragile living thing. There are no Dewey Decimal Systems here, just memory, respect, and whispers of, "Don't bend the corner or I swear." Families begin hiding their manuscripts during unstable times, not out of paranoia, but instinct. There's a growing understanding that these books, written on fragile paper with locally made ink, often bound in leather softened by shea butter, are more than reading material. They are legacy. And some of them are surprisingly personal. Sure, there are thick volumes on jurisprudence, medicine, astronomy, and grammar, but there are also dreamy love poems, medicinal recipes that involve crocodile bile and goat urine. Do not try this at home. And astrological charts scribbled on the backs of legal rulings. There's even a manuscript you stumble upon that contains both a marriage contract and a recipe for date syrup. Because why not be legally bound and well-fed?
You visit a family that proudly lays out their collection. It's not large, maybe 20 volumes, but they speak of each one like an old friend. The matriarch touches the pages with a reverence usually reserved for relics. Her grandfather copied one of them by hand, staying up night after night under the flickering light of an oil lamp. She laughs as she tells you how he used to fall asleep mid-copying and wake up with ink on his cheek. The manuscript has smudges to prove it. There's even one section where a line trails off entirely, like he just nodded off mid-sentence. A sleepy scribe's signature, centuries before autocorrect. But here's the quieter magic of this era, the transition from public to private. The great public libraries of Timbuktu, the ones you remember from earlier, aren't abandoned, but they lose their centrality. Instead, the manuscript tradition becomes increasingly familial, more intimate, less like a university and more like a dinner table. Knowledge gets tucked into trunks, wrapped in cloth, hidden in roof beams. Oral recitation becomes a failsafe. Children memorize passages by listening to their parents chant them softly in the evenings. A city of books becomes a city of memory keepers. Historians still argue whether this period marks the death of Timbuktu's golden age, or simply its transformation into a quieter, decentralized model of scholarship. But the manuscripts never disappear. They just hide better. You stop by a trader's shop where, beneath bolts of indigo-dyed cloth, lie manuscripts for sale. Technically, it's frowned upon, but technically, most things are. Some volumes are battered, brittle, edges curled from too many desert nights. Others are pristine, with ink so sharp it looks fresh. The trader shrugs. Some people need the money. Others don't know what they have. You ask if he reads them. He grins. Of course not, but I like the smell. To be fair, you've noticed it too. The musty sweetness of old leather, aged ink, a little smoke from too many years near hearths. It smells like time itself sat down for tea. Outside, life keeps grinding on. The mosques still call for prayer, though their roofs need patching. The markets still bustle, though with fewer foreign accents. Camels still spit, children still chase chickens, and every now and then, someone recites a verse from memory that their great-grandfather once wrote in a margin. Because here's the twist. When the world stopped listening to Timbuktu, Timbuktu didn't stop talking. It just lowered its voice. Now you wander further toward the outskirts, past walls that once bordered elite quarters, past wells gone dry. You reach a hill where a few shepherds graze their goats. The city stretches before you, mud brick roofs, minarets, and the silent shadows of what used to be. But as you sit and watch the sun slide down like a sleepy coin, you feel no sense of despair. Timbuktu never really tried to be loud. It never claimed to be a capital of empire or power. Its greatness was always quiet, cloaked in dust and scripture. And in this moment, looking out over its curled edges and soft colors, you understand something that isn't written down in any manuscript. Timbuktu's strength was never in its peak. It was in its persistence. The ability to fold itself smaller when needed, to tuck away its treasures, to murmur instead of shout, and to keep the pulse of knowledge alive, even as the world turned louder and harsher. You lie back in the grass. A soft wind stirs your cloak. Somewhere in the distance, someone is singing. Just a verse, just a thread of melody, drifting upward like smoke. The sky turns violet, then blue, then dark. And in the silence that follows, Timbuktu still breathes.
You wake before sunrise this time, stirred not by sound but by silence. That hushed kind that blankets everything like a desert fog, soft, weightless, but hiding more than it reveals. The stars are still out, the sky a dark indigo bowl, and the city of Timbuktu is holding still, as if listening for its own heartbeat. And maybe you are too. Because today you're heading out, way out, beyond the city walls, past the outskirts and into the dunes. Not to chase caravans or marvel at mirages, but to understand something crucial, something invisible but very, very real. Timbuktu didn't grow in isolation. It pulsed with the rhythms of the world because it was never just a city in the desert. It was a node, a trading node, a cultural node, a sleepy but sly little hub where goods, people, and ideas converged in sand and sunlight. So today's journey takes you along ancient paths, those faint scars across the land once trodden by camel caravans that seem to stretch from eternity in one direction to a mirage in the other. You're tracing the long veins of commerce that connected Timbuktu to the rest of the world. Routes where salt moved north, gold moved south, and knowledge slipped in between. Let's talk trade. You saddle up on a somewhat irritated camel, let's call him Bartholomew because he looks like one, and set off along one of the oldest and most important trade arteries in West Africa, the route between Timbuktu and the city of Sijil Massa, deep in Morocco. This wasn't a weekend road trip. We're talking 1,000 miles of sand, sun, and occasional banditry. Caravans could take up to 3 months to complete the journey, if they didn't get lost, robbed, or swallowed by the Sahara first. You probably wouldn't survive it, honestly. Sorry. But the rewards? Oh, the rewards. Gold was one of the big ones, lots of it, coming from the lands further south like Wangara and Bure. It flowed northward, first to Timbuktu, then on to North Africa, and eventually into the pockets of eager European merchants who really, really liked shiny things. Salt came the other way, especially from the massive mines at Tagaza. Imagine an entire town built out of salt blocks. And not just for flavoring your fries, salt was a preservative, a currency, a necessity for life in hot climates. In some places, it was literally worth its weight in gold. You ride through the imaginary echo of one of these caravans. Picture hundreds of camels, each one swaying under loads of salt slabs, textile bundles, or fine books wrapped in waxed cloth. Drivers chant softly to keep time. There's the occasional shout, a squeaky saddle, a bird that probably shouldn't be here. And maybe, just maybe, a scholar traveling with them. Because ideas hitched rides too. Arabic calligraphy, Islamic theology, philosophical texts from far-off lands, they all traveled alongside goods, carried in the minds and saddlebags of men who thought deeply while sweating profusely. That's how Timbuktu became more than a waypoint. It became a filter. The knowledge coming from the Islamic world, Baghdad, Cairo, Al-Andalus, didn't just get deposited here. It got reinterpreted, translated, sometimes challenged, sometimes merged with local traditions. The scholars of Timbuktu weren't just copy-pasters, they were thinkers. And here's your quirky tidbit for the day. In some of these manuscripts, you'll find astrological charts drawn alongside Islamic prayers, or mathematical treatises that cite both Aristotle and some unnamed village elder who really knew his stuff about stars. Cultural blending, anyone? You stop at a former caravanserai, basically a desert Airbnb for camels. The ruins are faint, but you can still see the outline of an old wall, the circular indent of a fire pit, a rusted iron ring used to tether something large and probably grumpy. A trader once stayed here, weary after weeks of travel, his cargo packed with North African textiles, spices, copperware, and, yes, books. Always books. He exchanged these for gold, kola nuts, ostrich feathers, and manuscripts written in smudgy ink by a student named Abdul, who constantly ran out of room on the page and just wrote sideways in the margin. You return to the city by evening, sand caked in your eyebrows, and a new appreciation for early trade logistics. You're greeted not by trumpets or fanfare, but by the low hum of the market beginning to stir for the night. Timbuktu doesn't celebrate itself, it just continues. Inside one small shop, a map hangs on the wall. It's not accurate, not in the cartographer's sense, but it tells the truth. Lines crisscross the desert like veins. Points are labeled not just with names, but with smells, tastes, and stories. Timbuktu is at the center. But remember, it's not the wealth that kept the city thriving. It was the traffic, the motion, the exchange. Gold might have sparkled. Books lingered. One of the most astonishing discoveries in recent decades has been just how many of Timbuktu's manuscripts reference places far beyond the Sahel. There are documents with Hebrew characters, pages referencing Chinese silk, notes about Portuguese ships that float on the sea like stars on a black cloth. Historians still argue whether Timbuktu had direct contact with these distant cultures or if its knowledge came through many layers of trade. But one thing is clear: the world reached Timbuktu, and in its own sleepy way, Timbuktu reached back. And now you sit beneath the stars again, this time with a trader who tells you stories passed down from his grandfather, about how his ancestors used to tie amulets into their camel's fur to protect them from sandstorms, about a scholar who once traveled all the way to Cairo just to ask a question, then forgot it when he got there. You sip mint tea. It's lukewarm. You don't care. Because the deeper you go into Timbuktu's story, the more you realize this was never a city of isolation. Its silence was never emptiness. It was a pause between arrivals, a breath before conversation, a page between chapters. Even now, people in Timbuktu will point to ancient family trees that trace back to Berber traders, Andalusian scholars, Tuareg chieftains, and sub-Saharan kings. Lineages woven like thread through the tapestry of trade. And still, those manuscripts. They remain the proof. Each one is a traveler too, a document that once moved with the caravans, passed through hands both careful and clumsy, slept in satchels, and listened to the wind outside tents. And now they rest in dark, quiet rooms, breathing gently under linen wraps, waiting for someone to read them again. Or maybe to dream them.
You wake to the sound of rustling paper. Not the sharp, slick flutter of modern pages, but something older, dry, deliberate, like leaves in late autumn, or someone gently folding time. It takes a moment to realize you're still in Timbuktu, still gliding through its long, drowsy heartbeat. And today, the heartbeat echoes through trade winds, gold dust, and a book or two that may or may not still have crumbs from a very old snack tucked between the margins. Today, you drift deeper into the golden web that once made Timbuktu shimmer with global significance. Literally, gold. It wasn't just a luxury here, it was a medium, a message, a link in the chain that tied Timbuktu to kingdoms, traders, and empires far beyond the sand. You crouch beside a low stone table in a courtyard, watching a merchant polish a worn nugget of gold with the sleeve of his robe.
It's smaller than a walnut, but it holds weight, not just in grams, but in promise. And the promise for centuries was this: if you could reach Timbuktu, you could access the wealth of a world. Now, gold didn't come from the city itself. Timbuktu wasn't sitting on a magic hill that spat out nuggets like popcorn. Instead, the goldfields of West Africa, especially the famed Bure and Wangara regions deep to the south, were the real source. Those fields fed empires, Ghana, Mali, and later Songhai. And they all, at various times, funneled that golden pulse northward, right through this sleepy city on the edge of the desert. You're following the pulse now. Imagine merchants loading camel after camel with gold dust packed tightly in leather pouches. The dust wasn't just stored, it was measured carefully, using scales that made jewelers weep with envy. In some cases, they even poured it into hollowed-out quills or eggshells for safekeeping. Yes, eggshells. Apparently, even thieves had limits on what they wanted to crack open. And on the other end of the line, salt. We've talked about it, but the trade-off still staggers the mind. Gold for salt. One heavy and glittering, the other crumbling and white, but both essential. And through this shimmering exchange, Timbuktu became the elegant, sand-dusted toll booth for civilizations. Of course, where there's gold, there's also drama. You've heard the name Mansa Musa. You probably remember him mostly for being the richest man who ever lived. But what really made his 14th century pilgrimage legendary wasn't just the gold he gave away. It was how he redistributed Timbuktu's global narrative. When Musa passed through Cairo on his Hajj to Mecca, he caused a local economic crisis just by being too generous. He flooded the markets with gold, and boom, prices went haywire for a decade. It's one of the few times in history someone broke the economy just by tipping well. But more than the gold, it was what Musa represented. A connection between Timbuktu and the Islamic world. A living billboard saying, hey, there's a glittering center of trade and knowledge way out in the desert, and it's open for business. And people came. Scholars, traders, poets, adventurers, con artists, the occasional camel impersonator, all seeking gold, or at least the stories surrounding it. Now you're seated under a canopy woven from palm fronds, and an elder is showing you an old trading record. It's ink faded, but the entry's clear. It lists gold amounts exchanged not just for salt, but for fine textiles, copper, North African ceramics, even a batch of fire paste from China, possibly early gunpowder, though historians still argue whether that particular entry was literal or poetic. See? Told you that debate rule would pop up again. Because there are debates, endless ones, about the scale of trade, the exact routes, the prices. Did Timbuktu trade directly with Mediterranean merchants, or was it all middlemen and whispers? Scholars pore over manuscripts, scratching their heads over abbreviations and metaphors. Some argue that the true trade economy was smaller than the legends suggest, more romanticized than real. Others believe we've barely scratched the surface of what was happening under the sand. But everyone agrees on one thing. Timbuktu wasn't just trading goods, it was trading access. It was a gateway between sub-Saharan Africa and the Islamic world, a middleman city that handled introductions like a maitre d' who's seen 1,000 deals go down over lukewarm tea. You sip yours now, letting the mint leaves settle. Your guide points to an old route leading south. That one, he says softly, is where the real gold came from. It's called the Road to Wangara, and even now it feels more legend than geography. Traders would vanish into the forests, sometimes for months. The people of Wangara were famously secretive, never revealing the exact locations of their mines.
There are stories, half whispers, half warnings, about how outsiders who tried to locate the sources themselves often didn't come back. Didn't we say you probably wouldn't survive this? Back in Timbuktu, you walk past an old merchant house, its walls crumbling slightly, but still standing proud. Inside are ledgers from 5 generations ago, each page cataloging shipments of gold dust, exchange rates for salt slabs, and sometimes odd notes like, "Buyer smelled strongly of goat, proceed with caution." You can almost smell the ink, hear the slow scratching of a pen on parchment. Picture the room lit by oil lamp, someone counting coins slowly, whispering numbers under their breath. And alongside this quiet bustle of trade, the scholars were at work. Because here's the thing, gold funded the schools. Wealthy patrons, whether rulers or traders, would sponsor a scholar or pay for a manuscript to be copied. Sometimes they commissioned new works entirely. "Write me a treatise on stars," one merchant might say, "and make sure it includes that thing about Mars being cranky." The result? A city where economic wealth and intellectual wealth fueled each other. The more trade flourished, the more books were written. The more books were written, the more prestigious the city became, attracting even more merchants who, yep, you guessed it, wanted their kids to study there. It's the oldest form of academic hype. "My son studies in Timbuktu," someone would boast. And the response? A respectful nod, maybe even a bit of jealousy. You're in one of the old madrasas now, empty but humming with memory. The blackboard is just a patch of wall where fingers once traced letters in chalk. There's a groove in the floor where hundreds of feet have shuffled. In the corner, a small wooden chest lies half open. Inside, a rolled scroll with notes on trade law, handwritten in Arabic and suspiciously stained with something reddish. Pomegranate juice, let's go with that. Outside, the sun is dipping again. You've noticed it always seems to be dipping, like time itself is stretching out the golden hour in this place. And maybe that's fitting, because Timbuktu's story, at least during its golden age, isn't one of sudden explosion or instant fame. It's the story of layers, trade routes built over generations, ideas passed from one hand to the next, gold sifted grain by grain into a city that knew exactly how to wait. And as you stand there now, on a worn street corner with manuscripts in one direction and desert trade in the other, you start to understand why the world once leaned toward Timbuktu, like flowers to the sun. It wasn't just the gold, it was the gravity.
By now, your feet know the rhythm of Timbuktu better than your thoughts do. They find their way through alleys and courtyards as if led by memory, not muscle. And today, they guide you towards something quieter, subtler, but no less powerful. Because while Timbuktu's gold may have glinted in the eyes of merchants and kings, its true power was scribbled in ink. Today, you walk among the manuscripts. Not just the ones in grand libraries with impressive names, though yes, those too, but the ones in attics and under beds, wrapped in cloth, kissed by dust. Timbuktu's knowledge doesn't just live on shelves. It lives in stories, in margins, in the hush between turning pages. You're not here to study. You're here to wander, drift through a different kind of city, one made of parchment, memory, and the occasional inkblot mistake that turned a sentence about astronomy into one about angry chickens. It happens. You're at the Ahmed Baba Institute first, a name you'll hear more than once, because Ahmed Baba was kind of the rock star of Timbuktu's golden age. Scholar, teacher, bibliophile. Arrested once by invading Moroccans for owning too many books, which, if we're being honest, is the best possible rap sheet to have. The Institute is part library, part fortress, part time machine. Here, conservators work in near silence, hunched under magnifying lenses, delicately brushing centuries off each page. Some manuscripts are no larger than your palm. Others are the size of pizza boxes, if pizza were written in dense Arabic script and occasionally interrupted by diagrams of stars or scribbled love poetry.
And oh, the subjects. Law, yes. Theology, of course. But also astronomy, medicine, philosophy, botany, geography, mathematics, music, satire, even dream interpretation. Because what's a sleepy city without a manual for decoding that weird thing with the flying crocodile? One manuscript is a 16th century treatise on optics. Another outlines how to diagnose various fevers using urine color and the lunar calendar. You don't have to understand all of it. The point is, these weren't just religious tracts copied ad nauseum. These were working texts, texts of inquiry. Timbuktu was thinking. And it wasn't thinking in isolation. As you run your fingers along the edges of a manuscript that quotes Al-Ghazali, you realize this isn't a sleepy backwater pretending to be smart. This is part of a much larger scholarly network stretching from Baghdad to Cairo to Fez to Cordoba. Timbuktu's scholars were in correspondence with their peers across continents, letters sent with caravans, debates carried across the desert like whispered arguments riding camelback. Some of those letters survive. One sits before you now, its paper thin and creased like a forgotten map. It's a response from a Moroccan scholar to a question sent by a student in Timbuktu. The topic? Whether the moon had agency or was merely a reflection. It's phrased so elegantly you almost forget it's basically a celestial who wore it better.
Historians still argue whether these manuscript collections were meant for wide public use or confined to elite scholarly circles. But either way, there's no denying their scale. Estimates suggest over 700,000 manuscripts once existed in Timbuktu and its surrounding towns, many still hidden in private homes, brought out only during festivals or family gatherings, and some are still being found. You meet a man who claims his grandmother kept 4 manuscripts under her bed for decades, wrapped in goat leather, nestled between blankets, and read aloud only during the Harmattan winds. One of them, it turns out, is an untranslated medical text with diagrams of plants no one's yet identified. He lets you hold it for a moment. It smells like dust and rosemary. The ink has faded to sepia. The handwriting is careful, but you can tell the scribe was hurrying toward the end. Maybe he was copying by candlelight. Maybe he just wanted to catch the end of a good story being told outside. Because Timbuktu wasn't only about knowledge, it was about shared knowledge. Madrasas weren't ivory towers. They were part of the city's fabric. Classes were often held in open courtyards. Students recited aloud. Debates happened during walks, in markets, even while waiting for bread. You step into one of those old learning spaces now, a small, sunlit courtyard where the air feels thick with thought. There's a groove worn into the stone where dozens of students once sat, knees tucked, heads bent. On one wall, there's graffiti from centuries ago, a name scratched in childlike Arabic over and over again. Maybe a student trying to master calligraphy, or maybe someone just desperate to be remembered. Outside, the call to prayer rolls over the city like silk. You keep walking. You pass a woman teaching her granddaughter the first lines of a poem. You pass a man sorting manuscripts by moonlight, his fingers careful but confident. You pass a pile of texts rescued from floods and termites, their pages still damp but breathing. And yes, there are jokes too. One marginal note, written in frustrated scrawl, reads, "This scribe has the handwriting of a dancing goat." Another, barely legible, simply says, "Beware of the camel with the crooked left eye." What it has to do with theology is unclear, but the warning feels oddly sincere. And in the midst of all this, the pages, the jokes, the prayers, the calculations, you start to sense something rare. Timbuktu didn't just preserve knowledge, it trusted it. It didn't seal wisdom behind glass or raise it on pedestals. It passed it around like shared bread, letting each generation nibble a little,
add a note in the margins, correct a mistake, or ask a better question. Even now, many families in Timbuktu treat their manuscript collections as living heirlooms. They're not just books, they're ancestors, echoes, a way to say, we were here, we thought about things, we asked questions that mattered to us. You stop for a moment, the wind shifts, and suddenly the whole city feels like a manuscript. A long, careful composition, some parts faded, others sharp, layers of commentary stacked over centuries. And in the margin, just there, you spot yourself. A quiet reader, a wanderer in a city of pages, not here to study or conquer, just here to listen. And as you step back into the sun, someone is reciting again. A passage from an old legal text. The words bounce off the walls, echoing in the alleys, lifting like dust on a breeze. Timbuktu is still speaking. You just have to slow down to hear it.
Your path curves through the morning light, soft and golden as it spills across the sand-colored stones of Timbuktu's oldest quarter. The hum of conversation, the clink of tea glasses, and the occasional donkey bray serve as background music. But today, you're tuning in to something quieter, something that lingers not in buildings or books, but in echoes. Because Timbuktu may have faded from the world stage, but its afterimage still dances in places far beyond the desert. What happens to a city's soul after its golden age ends? You're about to find out. The Songhai Empire is still buzzing in the air here. You may not see its banners or soldiers anymore, but its cultural DNA is woven into the city's rhythm, like a bass line you only notice when it stops. After the decline of Mali and the retreat of Mansa Musa's golden wave, Timbuktu didn't wither, it reinvented. Songhai rose from the ashes, and by the 15th century, Timbuktu had become its crown jewel, not for gold, but for brains. Songhai's rulers, particularly Askia Muhammad, understood that intellectual prestige was political power. And so Timbuktu's scholarly traditions continued, nourished by state support. New manuscripts were commissioned, old ones preserved. Students arrived in greater numbers. The University of Sankore flourished, not with lecture halls and ID cards, but with ink-stained scrolls, oral debate, and arguments that could stretch until the stars rose. And even after Songhai's fall, the ideas stuck around. They spread. Northward, through Moroccan scholars who took manuscripts as trophies. Southward, with griots and oral storytellers who carried tales of Timbuktu's wisdom across the savannas. Eastward, with travelers who recounted the city's book markets like they were shrines. And westward, eventually, into memory, legend, and longing. You feel that longing now. Because Timbuktu didn't just influence politics or economics, it seeped into identity. The Mutapa and Razvi states, rising in southern Africa centuries later, may not have traded directly with Timbuktu, but they moved within the same intellectual weather system. Oral traditions mention cities of scholars and places where the stars were read like maps. These echoes, half truth, half myth, hint at a southward flow of inspiration. More tangibly, the spread of Islam across the Sahel carried fragments of Timbuktu's worldview. Legal traditions, poetic forms, mnemonic teaching methods, all carried on caravans of thought. You sit with a musician in a nearby village. He plucks a stringed instrument whose origins trace back to West African griots, but whose tuning system carries hints of Andalusian theory, brought across the desert via Timbuktu's scholar traders. He sings in a language you don't know, but the melody feels old, coiled like smoke around the spires of the Jingareber Mosque. And there's something else riding that melody: pride. Because Timbuktu didn't just influence people, it became a symbol. A symbol of Black African intellect, of Muslim African scholarship, of resistance to the lazy colonial myth that knowledge only flowed from north to south. Even when it was pillaged, occupied, and erased from maps, Timbuktu endured as metaphor. From here to Timbuktu became shorthand for the edge of the known world. But in a curious twist, that very distance made the city mythic. You see it in the 19th century European explorers, René Caillet, Heinrich Barth, risking their lives to reach a city they'd read about in whispered reports and romantic exaggerations. What they found was not streets paved with gold, but something rarer: an African city whose soul was ink and intellect. And even today, Timbuktu is reclaimed and reframed by modern African thinkers and artists, in Senegalese poetry, in Malian hip-hop, in academic conferences debating Timbuktu's manuscripts in air-conditioned rooms oceans away. You see it in UNESCO's designation of Timbuktu as a World Heritage Site in 1988, acknowledging that what was once called a backwater was, in fact, one of humanity's great cultural capitals. And you hear it in the chant of students reciting ancient texts, in lullabies, in protest songs. Because Timbuktu's legacy doesn't sit in glass cases, it sings. You sit beneath a baobab tree now, watching a child trace letters in the sand. His grandmother, sitting beside him, corrects his strokes gently, rhythmically, like it's part of a ritual older than both of them. Maybe it is. Because in many households across Mali and beyond, fragments of Timbuktu's scholarly tradition survive in unexpected ways. Mnemonic devices passed down like family recipes, proverbs with footnotes baked in, genealogies recited with the precision of a legal brief. Some of the surviving manuscripts even contain music, written not in notes, but in poetic meter, meant to be sung. One describes the rhythm of planetary movements as a kind of celestial drumbeat. Historians still argue whether these musical notations were ever performed or merely symbolic. But honestly, you're leaning toward performance. You can feel the rhythm. Timbuktu was never a place for silent knowledge. It danced, and still does. Modern Timbuktu isn't trapped in the past. Yes, the tourism industry has struggled. Yes, conflict and instability have shaken the city more than once in the last 100 years. But its people, librarians, imams, tour guides, musicians, mothers, have kept its essence alive. During the 12 insurgency, when militants threatened to destroy ancient manuscripts, a secret rescue operation quietly smuggled hundreds of thousands of texts out of the city in footlockers, rice sacks, and even fruit crates. Carried by night, hidden under vegetables, whispered from house to house. Think about that. Think about risking your life to save a 15th century astronomy manual with wine stains on page 43. Because someone did. And not just one someone, hundreds. Ordinary citizens who understood that Timbuktu's legacy wasn't just academic, it was personal. You stroll now through the alleys again, and you begin to notice something. Each wall is an archive. Each shadow a footnote. Each pause in conversation a space where history once stepped, looked around, and said, "This will do." Because Timbuktu isn't a ghost, it's a ripple. And ripples don't fade, they spread. Across borders, across generations, across disciplines and deserts and dialects, across the ink-stained fingers of a boy reciting Quranic verse, across the hand of a father passing down a manuscript, across the lips of a griot retelling a story slightly wrong, but just right. And so you sit. You let your fingers trail over the rough wall. You let your eyes blur into the past. And in that stillness, you realize Timbuktu never really fell. It echoed.
You find yourself retracing old steps again, but this time you're not chasing kings or scrolls, you're chasing shadows. Specifically, the kind that falls strangely across stone, that twist at certain hours, that seem to hint at purpose but offer no instructions. You've reached the part of Timbuktu's story where everything feels like a riddle. Not because it's lost, but because it was never written down in the way your modern brain expects. Timbuktu, for all its pages, also lives in stone, and some of that stone has been keeping secrets for centuries. You step into the courtyard of the Sankor Mosque again, and your eyes catch on something you missed before. A small conical tower rising out of the prayer hall like a chess piece. It doesn't quite match the surrounding architecture. It's not decorative, it doesn't seem structural, but it insists on being there. And it's not the only one. Scattered throughout the old quarters of Timbuktu are curious architectural forms, half sculpture, half signal. Cones, grooves, elevated platforms, small stone pillars embedded in walls, compass-like patterns traced into mud brick. Most passers-by never notice them. But you're not most passers-by anymore. You're chasing the lingering whispers of meaning. One particularly mysterious structure stands in the remains of a scholar's house, just a waist-high tower made of baked clay bricks stacked with mathematical precision. Local children once called it the whisper post. When you press your ear to it, the wind really does seem to hum. Some believe these structures were symbolic representations of knowledge, shaped according to esoteric geometry meant to mirror celestial alignments. Others think they were tools, sundials, compasses, markers for the direction of Mecca before GPS made everything boring. Historians still argue whether these forms had ritual purposes, scientific functions, or were simply architectural flourishes. But as you run your fingers along the rough edge of one, you suspect the answer might be yes to all of the above. Because in Timbuktu, symbolism wasn't decoration, it was a second language. You remember those manuscripts from earlier? The ones with the oddly specific diagrams, intersecting circles, nested triangles, solar lines, crescent faces. One page even depicted what looks like a compass rose built around the names of prophets. Scholars now think some of these drawings might be encoded instructions for building certain structures, or maybe prayer schedules tied to planetary motion, or maybe elaborate jokes. What happens when a theologian tries to diagram the universe? A really intense game of connect the dots. No one's completely sure. And that uncertainty, it's kind of the best part. Because Timbuktu's mystery isn't frustrating, it's comforting. It means there's still more to learn. You follow a local guide through a neighborhood rumored to have once hosted secret astronomical classes. He stops beside a windowless mud brick wall and gestures to 3 faint indentations near the roofline. Venus, Saturn, Mars, he says, only visible during the Harmattan season if you look through from inside. Inside the house, there's a single narrow slit in the roof. Once a year, at a precise time, sunlight cuts through that slit and illuminates a carved mark in the floor. It's not dramatic, it's quiet. And that quiet is louder than any monument. You remember that ancient text you saw earlier, describing the universe as a book written in concentric circles. Maybe these little architectural riddles are part of that same book. Maybe they were never meant to be understood all at once, or even alone. Maybe they were meant to be lived with. Like a poem pinned to the wall, a riddle that doesn't need an answer, a meditation in mud and brick. And then there's the famous House of the Scholars debate, now just a partial ruin with scattered stones. Legend has it that during the 16th century, this was the site of weekly intellectual sparring on theology, astronomy, medicine, and occasionally the moral implications of date syrup. Local lore claims one stone pillar was struck during a particularly heated debate about whether humans could influence the movement of stars through prayer. It cracked down the middle, and that crack? Still there. Some say it's a sign of divine response. Others say the scholar just tripped. Either way, it's in the story now, and stories matter here. They're the mortar holding the mystery together. In recent years, archaeologists have begun re-examining these features using digital modeling and satellite imaging. They're tracing solar paths, testing alignments, using drones to uncover spatial patterns in Timbuktu's city grid. Some buildings appear to line up with lunar events or important dates in the Islamic calendar. Still, many residents shake their heads at the researchers. Because when you grow up with these mysteries, you don't try to solve them. You sit beside them. You listen to them breathe. You're beginning to understand that now. You walk a little slower. Let your shadow stretch beside one of those strange stone cones. And then you remember something. A manuscript fragment you saw earlier, just a torn corner with a scribbled note in faded ink. To know a place, measure its silence. You smile. It fits. Because Timbuktu's legacy isn't just in what it taught, but in how it taught it. The unfinished questions, the structures that only reveal meaning if you stop rushing. And sometimes, when the wind is right, the city teaches you by doing nothing at all. By letting you stand in the sand and feel very, very small. There's beauty in that, isn't there? You sit now on the edge of a rooftop, overlooking the crumbling skyline. Children play in the alley below. Someone is frying something that smells suspiciously delicious. A radio plays a song that's at least 4 centuries younger than the stone beneath your feet. And all around you, the whisper of riddles. Some written, some built, some still forming. In a few centuries, maybe someone else will walk here. Maybe they'll find your footprints and wonder what you were doing. Maybe they'll guess wrong. Maybe they'll guess beautifully. And that's the point. Not to decode Timbuktu completely, but to let it stay mysterious, just enough to keep asking questions.
The wind picks up again, swirling a soft veil of dust across your path as you move toward the outer edge of the old city. You're leaving the heart of Timbuktu, but not its hold on you. Because just when you think you've seen all there is, the manuscripts, the scholars, the whispered geometry of old rooftops, there's one more twist in the tale. Not about the city, but about the world outside it, and what it did with Timbuktu's memory. You step into a modest archive building, barely marked, sun-faded, easy to miss. Inside, the air shifts. It smells like linen paper, beeswax, and something faintly metallic. You're surrounded by thousands of manuscripts, some recovered, others barely rescued. And above you, a hand-painted sign. Timbuktu is not lost. It's more than a slogan. It's a declaration. Because this section of the story is not about the past. It's about the comeback. And about the people who refuse to let Timbuktu fade into footnotes. Let's go back just a little, say to 2012. The northern region of Mali is in upheaval. Islamist militants seize control of Timbuktu. For months, they impose harsh rule, banning music, burning sacred objects, threatening anyone suspected of heresy, including those who preserve the city's pre-Islamic or Sufi heritage. Among the targets, manuscripts. Those fragile, centuries-old scrolls, the ones you've seen tucked in trunks, stitched in goatskin, inked by candlelight. They were suddenly at risk of being destroyed, wiped from existence. But the people of Timbuktu are used to moving wisdom through dangerous places. And so began what some call the Great Manuscript Rescue, Ordinary librarians, families, and local volunteers quietly smuggled hundreds of thousands of texts out of the city. Not in armored trucks, not with digital encryption, but in rice sacks, in backpacks, in crates marked vegetables. They passed them along like sacred contraband, under cover of night, dodging checkpoints, bribing drivers, whispering directions by candlelight. Some were moved hundreds of miles south to Bamako. Others went underground, literally, buried beneath floorboards and courtyards. Historians still argue whether this operation was planned as a single coordinated effort or emerged organically across many households. Either way, it worked. Roughly 95% of Timbuktu's manuscript heritage survived. Let that sink in. Because in an age where entire libraries can disappear with a crashed server, here was a city that protected its wisdom with nothing but determination, stealth, and sheer love for knowledge. You run your fingers over one of the crates, wooden, scuffed, labeled in French and Arabic. Inside is a manuscript from the 1500s. Its topic? Astronomy and ethics. Because, of course, those two go together here. And beside it, a smaller book, handwritten in local Songhai dialect. It's a list of village proverbs, annotated with jokes. This isn't just preservation, it's resistance. And it's not over.
Modern archivists and librarians in Mali, many trained on the job with no formal degrees, are now working to restore and digitize these manuscripts. With the help of international partners, they've built scanning labs, conservation rooms, and metadata systems. It's not glamorous, it's painstaking. One page at a time, one fragile spine, one crumb of ink. You watch as a technician delicately lifts a leaf of parchment, places it under a scanner, waits for the soft click. No fanfare, no applause, just quiet heroism. And the world is noticing. In the last decade, scholars from across the globe have begun reassessing Timbuktu's place in intellectual history, no longer as some curious outpost of African learning, but as a major engine of it. Academic institutions in South Africa, Germany, the US, and elsewhere are now collaborating on open access manuscript platforms. There's an ongoing debate about ownership, of course. Who should control these manuscripts? Where they should be stored? Whether digitization dilutes their cultural value? But one thing is clear, they're alive again. In university classrooms, in policy forums, in digital apps where school kids in Bamako can swipe through centuries of poetry with their thumbs. You sit down with a young scholar, 23 years old, phone in one hand, manuscript in the other. She's translating a 14th century text on leadership into Bambara, line by line, adding emojis to make it relatable. You're skeptical. She smiles. You want young people to care? Make it speak their language. She's not wrong. Because preservation isn't just about keeping things old. It's about keeping them relevant. And that's the part of Timbuktu's revival you didn't expect. It's not just an effort to freeze history in amber, it's an effort to activate it. Across Mali, educators are integrating Timbuktu's manuscript heritage into school curricula, not just as a source of pride, but as a source of inquiry. Students study medieval texts on conflict resolution alongside modern politics. They compare Sufi poetry with spoken word rap. They write essays asking, what would a Timbuktu scholar say about climate change? And in doing so, they're not just remembering the past, they're extending it. There's also the music. In 2013, musicians who had fled Timbuktu during the conflict began returning, slowly, tentatively. Many had been silenced, instruments destroyed, songs banned. Now, they're playing again. And here's the secret. A lot of those songs are history lessons in disguise. One ballad, set to a hypnotic ngoni rhythm, recounts the manuscript rescue, but with characters renamed as desert animals. Another reworks a 16th century hymn into a modern protest anthem. You sway to the rhythm, the dust rising around your ankles like applause. Timbuktu's comeback isn't flashy. It's not some big-budget UNESCO theme park. It's quiet, decentralized, held together by neighbors, cousins, librarians, bootleg scanners, and beat-up motorbikes. And that's why it's working. Because Timbuktu never relied on empires to prop it up. It relied on people, regular people, dreamers, copiers, debaters, kids scribbling astronomy notes between chores. And now, they're back. So you step outside, into the deep gold of late afternoon. The wind has calmed. The air smells of earth and tea and potential. Ahead of you, a group of teens gathered on a rooftop, watching the sun drop low over the desert. One of them is reading aloud, badly but enthusiastically, from a sheaf of photocopied pages. The others heckle him, then applaud. You smile, because Timbuktu isn't in ruins, it's in recovery. And every joke, every scan, every rooftop reading is part of the rebuild. You walk on, the sun dipping low behind the horizon. The stars above you blink awake, one by one. And you remember, this city once mapped them. And maybe, just maybe, it still does.
The stars settle deeper into the sky as you move through the quiet lanes of Timbuktu. No longer a tourist or even a visitor, but something softer, a student. One of many in a long, unbroken line of curious, ink-fingered wanderers. You're not alone. Even now, even here, long after the golden age has faded, the city hums with life, not just in the manuscripts and minarets, but in memory. Tonight, your story slips from stone to spirit. You're entering the afterlife of Timbuktu. No, not ghosts and haunted scrolls, though honestly, would that surprise you at this point? What you're exploring now is cultural memory, the Timbuktu that breathes quietly in the modern mind, the Timbuktu that lives in festivals, lullabies, classrooms, graffiti, even in memes shared on cracked smartphones. And yes, in bedtime history podcasts too. You pass by a school. It's modest, mud walls, plastic chairs, a chalkboard so well used it barely needs new chalk. But on the wall is a painted quote in Songhai, "Wisdom is the lamp that doesn't sleep." The kids here grow up knowing the name Ahmed Baba as easily as others know Einstein. They recite passages from centuries-old texts between TikTok dances. Their teachers don't frame Timbuktu as ancient, they frame it as relevant, as theirs. It's a subtle magic, watching a city reborn, not in buildings, but in belonging. You see it in the names. A radio station called La Voix de Sankore, a community center named for Amina of Zaria, inspired by tales found in the rescued texts. A cafe that serves manuscript mochas, which taste suspiciously like instant coffee with too much cinnamon, but you love it anyway. You sit at a low table. Across from you, a group of local musicians set up for their set. There's a kora, a calabash drum, and an instrument made out of a rusted motorcycle gas tank, because history, like rhythm, adapts. They begin with a soft, droning melody, part lullaby, part invocation. One of them sings, voice low and steady. "We are the children of Sankore. Our alphabet is fire. Our silence is a kind of prayer." You close your eyes, and you can almost feel it, the soft overlap between then and now, between parchment and playlist. Of course, not everyone agrees on how Timbuktu's memory should be handled. Historians still argue whether the city is best preserved in its manuscripts, or in oral traditions, or in rebuilt monuments. Some argue that the manuscripts should stay in Mali, untouched by foreign hands. Others advocate for international stewardship, afraid of further conflict. Still others point to the living culture, the stories, music, and customs as the true heir of Timbuktu. But maybe it's not a debate to settle.
Maybe it's a recipe with many flavors, like a dish passed down through generations, tweaked with every telling. In the suburbs of Bamako, a teacher you meet runs an after-school program called Legacy Readers. Her students don't just learn about Timbuktu, they write as if they're in it. They pen fake diary entries from scholars. They illustrate made-up illuminated manuscripts with neon gel pens. One of them, a 9-year-old named Musa, writes about a scroll that teaches goats to read. Honestly, A+. Because that's the kind of connection that matters. Not just reverence, but imagination. You head back north, passing through towns where Timbuktu has become a whispered legend. In the markets, vendors sell replica scrolls, aged with coffee grounds. In weddings, ancient poems are recited in auto-tuned remix form. You even spot a pair of flip-flops stamped with Ahmed Baba Library since 1600-something. There's no line between preservation and parody anymore. And that's okay, because both keep memory alive. And memory, as it turns out, is stubborn. You meet an elder griot, one of the traditional storytellers. He's toothless, with eyes that have seen more sandstorms than sunsets, and he carries a battered notebook filled with scribbled verses. He tells you, Timbuktu is not a place, it is a rhythm in the tongue. Then he shows you a verse. They tried to bury our knowledge, but it knew how to dig. They burned our books, but not the song they hummed. Later, he performs that line in a call and response chant with neighborhood kids. And you realize something. The rebirth of Timbuktu isn't about buildings rising again. It's about recognition. It's about looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing a scholar's legacy in your eyes. It's about laughing through a history lesson, about scrolling through ancient wisdom on a modern phone, about refusing to let the world decide who's smart, who's civilized, who gets to be remembered. You move again, past a small community garden growing desert herbs. The teens tending it named their plot Sankaré Roots, because why not? One of them quotes a manuscript as he waters basil. The wise man prepares the soil before the rain. I think that means compost. You chuckle, he's not wrong. It all fits together now. Education as planting, stories as seeds, culture as a thing that grows not in palaces, but in cracked courtyards and plastic pots. And in between all this, whispers of old myths, half-true facts, sacred legends that probably started as jokes. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen? Still up for debate. You walk on as night deepens. The stars above now shimmer with a kind of gentle conspiracy, like they know something you don't. Something you'll never quite grasp. But that's okay, because Timbuktu has taught you how to rest with mystery and how to laugh at it. In your final moments tonight, you arrive at the banks of the Niger River once more. A small boat bobs quietly in the water, tethered by rope, carrying nothing but a stack of books and a sleeping cat. You don't know where it's headed, but you hope it drifts somewhere quiet, somewhere ready, because somewhere, someone else is waiting to learn that Timbuktu isn't just a city. It's a question, and an answer, and a very sleepy library boat sailing through the dark.
You follow the river for a while, slow steps softened by sand and night air. You're not in a hurry. Timbuktu has a way of slowing you down. not out of exhaustion, but reverence. Everything feels earned now, every stone, every whisper, every shadow. And here, where the river bends into silence, we end our journey, not with a climax, but with a quiet continuation. Because Timbuktu's story hasn't ended. It's simply resting. And now, you enter the last chapter, a soft look at what this city means now, not in textbooks, not in libraries, but in identity. What does it mean to belong to Timbuktu? To carry its name? To say, I am from here, when so many maps treat it as myth? Well, let's start with a reality check. If you ask 10 people around the world what Timbuktu means, 9 will probably say something like, it's that faraway place that may or may not exist, and they wouldn't be entirely wrong. The city has become shorthand for the middle of nowhere. It's used in cartoons, jokes, travel blogs with titles like Finding Timbuktu, Our Trip to the Ends of the Earth. 1,000 casual phrases fling the name around, from here to Timbuktu, without knowing it's real. That it's lived in. That people here wake up, sweep their doorsteps, sip tea, and remember exactly where they are. Timbuktu's image in the modern world swings wildly between the romantic, the tragic, the mispronounced, and the misunderstood. But for Malians, it's a place of pride. Ask anyone who's lived near it, learned from it, or carried even a sliver of its memory, and they'll tell you it's not the end of the earth. It's the center of something. That's why, even now, in the middle of global conferences and digital classrooms, the phrase University of Sankor appears like a watermark, an ancestral stamp of approval. Modern scholars cite it to reclaim the idea that Africa didn't wait for knowledge to arrive. It generated its own, quietly, abundantly, without asking permission. And in cities across the African continent, Timbuktu is being reborn again, not as a destination, but a symbol. In Ghana, a new library project inspired by the Timbuktu model is being constructed, with mud bricks and solar roofs. In Nigeria, teachers pass around photocopies of ancient texts discussing mathematics and ethics, just to remind students that you come from thinkers. Even in Europe, several museums now feature exhibits titled The Real Timbuktu, and yes, the irony is not lost. Because after centuries of being either dismissed or stolen from, the city's legacy is now gently being returned. Not with trumpets, but with care. Of course, there's still struggle. Timbuktu today faces poverty, lack of infrastructure, political instability. Internet is patchy, travel is difficult. There are still risks from armed conflict and climate change. But even in that struggle, the people here have something rare. They have memory. Not the kind etched into plaques, but the kind carried in hearts and habits. The kind that survives invasions and empires and jokes at its expense. And here's the kicker. It's not just Mali that carries Timbuktu now. It's you too. Yes, you, still lying there, eyes maybe drooping, brain trying to decide if you're dreaming or listening. You're part of the long, soft ripple of people touched by this place, because you stayed.
You followed the manuscripts. You wandered the mosques. You sat with scribes and cats and wandered marketplaces where words weighed more than coins. You learned that even the sleepiest city in the world once roared with ideas. And you didn't need flash or fury to be impressed. Just the rustle of pages. Just the hum of memory. Back near the Niger River, you watch a family unfold an old prayer rug. It's threadbare, faded, maybe a century old,
but still they treat it like gold. Not because of what it's made of, but because of where it came from, who touched it, what stories it carries. That's Timbuktu. It's never been about monuments. It's about transmission. And now you carry a little piece of that transmission too. You may not remember every date or name or theological debate. You may forget who hid what scroll in which goat barn. But you'll remember how this place felt, how the desert softened the noise, how the manuscripts whispered instead of shouted, how knowledge didn't need neon lights to shine. And maybe, someday, you'll see the word Timbuktu in passing, on a sign, in a joke, in a dusty corner of a trivia app, and you'll pause and smile, because you'll know you were there. And not just geographically. You were part of something patient, something stubborn, something that refuses to be forgotten. And now, one last story before we rest. A few years ago, a teacher in rural Mali gathered her class under a baobab tree. No electricity, no projector, no Wi-Fi, just shade and scrolls. She read from a copy of a 15th century Timbuktu manuscript about astronomy and ethics. Afterward, she asked her students what the stars meant to them. One girl said, "They mean there's always light above us, even when everything else is dark." And if that's not the perfect summary of Timbuktu, I don't know what is. Wind down, final 300 words. So now, as you lie still, body softening under the weight of blankets and time, let's let everything settle. Let the dust from Timbuktu fall gently back to earth. Let the stars overhead blink slowly into silence. You've wandered through stories layered like vellum, each page a little quieter, a little older. You've traced lines of ink that once pulsed with the thoughts of long-forgotten minds. You've wandered crooked alleys where wisdom once walked barefoot, and sat in doorways where children listened to poems instead of scoldings. And now, there's nothing left to do, except let it echo. Let your breath slow to match the rhythm of desert wind. Let your heart move like the Niger, unhurried, winding, purposeful. Let the last whispers of old scribes lull you like soft-spoken bedtime prayers into sleep. Because Timbuktu isn't a myth or a joke or a place too far to matter. It's a hush. It's a hum. It's a long, warm sigh that tells you wisdom waits, even now, even here. So close your eyes, sink just a little deeper. The city is still here, and so are you.